Okay, thank you guys for coming here. This is the Blockchain for Social Good panel. And I am here with three gentlemen, namely Kevin from Gitcoin, Ian from Toucan, and Vincent from Molecule and VitaDAO. I don't know whether you have caught on to that. We don't always have the best reputation in terms of being useful for society as an ecosystem. So these are three projects that have very much been identified as trying to do something good. And before we kind of dive into metrics and what we should optimize for and so on, maybe let's have all of you do a brief introduction, like on your project in a nutshell. I mean, just assume people weren't here for your talks.
Oh, yeah, okay. So yeah, Kevin Olsen. So I'm the co-lead of the GPC workstream in the Gitcoin DAO. So we're building the grants protocol and Passport and maintaining the existing Gitcoin code base, so helping people raise funds for public goods through matching quadratic funding.
My name's Ian. I'm the Web3 lead at Toucan. We provide the infrastructure layer to tokenize carbon credits off-chain and bring them on-chain with the ultimate goal of scaling the voluntary carbon markets and climate action in general.
I'm Vincent. I'm leading ecosystem initiatives at Molecule, where we basically build protocols to fund science with crypto, and also core at VitaDAO, where we fund specifically longevity research.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's wonderful. So we as builders, we know that it's super important to kind of have KPIs to track, right? So basically you need to have like some way of holding yourself accountable and monitoring your own progress. So basically having valuable metrics to track is super important. So basically if you look at your own projects, what metrics would you use to kind of convey or to prove that you've been successful? Maybe let's start with you, Kevin.
Yeah, so I mean, currently, our top line metric is the amount of money that we've moved through the ecosystem and into projects, right? So the total amount that we were able to raise through contributions from big projects, and then how much of the community supports that, and we steer that back to projects. So kind of like a TVL type top line metric for us. But I do think we can do better than that. I'm interested in getting into it maybe later.
Mm-hmm. For Toucan's side of things, we take a look at a very similar approach of TVL in the sense of how many carbon credits are bridged from the real world to on-chain. From there, we also kind of look at, as we're diversifying the demand sources for carbon, how many high-quality builders are working with carbon credits, building alternative use cases, and kind of forward-looking, we're kind of looking at how much money can we give back to the original project developers, and that's more, as you just pointed out, that's more of a forward-looking thing of where we'd like to optimize versus where we are now.
Yeah, it's also similar for us. I think the key with the metric is that it's to a degree actionable and like quick feedback, and I think for us it's also just like the amount of funding of research through our ecosystem. But I think they're like much better ones, but that also like only become apparent later, like how much value actually was created. Like for example, with us, if we funded 100 million of research, like if none of it translates and none of it reaches humans, and then we kind of failed. So, but that like is not apparent like in the moment when we fund it. But like of course there are ways to measure it like along the way, like kind of like even honestly through DeFi, like creating efficient markets around research, like early stage translational research has no market on it until it's basically ready. But like of course with to a degree also the hyper financialization of DeFi, I think you could create like markets, prediction markets, all kinds of markets around determining like how likely something is to work. So I think that's where actually DeFi I think is interesting also in a scientific context.
That's an interesting proposal, because I would assume that basically having efficient markets is kind of predicated on having a large number of experts that kind of have access to sufficient funding to kind of create this efficient market?
Yeah, Good question. I think it's like every market. I think right now it's a very inefficient market. So I think there's like not a lot of information. If like for example, we funded like 14 research projects. There's not a lot of information which one should be worth almost zero because there's like no translational impact, and which one should be worth 2 or 5 or whatever X because it has translational potential and might be bought out by like, for example, biotech or spin into biotech. And I think ultimately like in every early stage market, like with more inefficiency, there's like more incentive for people to come in to really, of course, speculate, but to start making the market more efficient. And so I think even if it's like 10 people in the market, it's a bit like a prediction market or betting market, which I know Gnu started out with, that even if it's like a few people, like the super forecasters, the super predictors, like they will get positive feedback loops by making money and will stick around. So I think it doesn't need that many people. It just needs people who are like domain experts and have a good sense of valuing, for example, the impact or the value of the science.
Okay, so you're talking more of a reputational prediction market, not so much a money prediction market, right?
It could literally be, for example, like IP NFT is the primitive we create. So, for example, VitaDAO funds a research project for, say, $500,000, and that's an IP NFT, and that could be fractionalized, and then it's basically, of course, the thing then to figure out is like a mechanism for fair price discovery. But then, for example, if there's updates coming in from the researcher, that should be reflected kind of in the value of the IP NFT. And then even like the speculation would flow back to fund more research, like the fees of the liquidity pools. But I think that's actually then an interesting thing. It becomes kind of like a DeFi challenge to create like the best market mechanisms for fair price discovery of translational research, for example. But it's also super early, like we're still scoping out, like fractionalizing the first IP NFT. And I think, getting this right is also important because I think it could also like be, like we've seen with fractionalized NFTs, like a very inefficient market that doesn't have the right incentives for fair price discovery. But like, for example, Pleaser DAO, like fractionalizing their dog NFT for $500 or something, and then selling it is like not the same incentive as like a fair price discovery around research to determine which research to further fund. But I think there's like a lot of different experiments, and I think that's also the power of crypto and Web3 is that we can run a lot of these experiments in parallel and way quicker than, say, in Web2 or like traditional science funding, and see what works. But I think it's definitely not sure way to value the impact yet. It's just like could be one experiment that could be interesting.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'll come back to you guys later. I haven't forgotten you. I just have a couple of things I kind of want to get out of Vincent first. So, Vincent, you guys have come to this research ecosystem, from Web3, and I would assume that researchers, having been, a fundamental researcher previously in like 2 lives back, they are often hesitant of market mechanisms, right? Because universities, at their very core, are not. Basically, if you're a fantastic researcher, you're not going to make more, or substantially more than an average researcher, right? Basically, it's all reputation-based. So there's a certain disdain for money and money-based systems in basic research. Have you found this, and how have people in that fairly, I want to say altruistic, and I think it's altruistic in some way, as that they're not monetizing their full potential, but it's also very protective of their own reputation, right? So basically, how have you found it to kind of enter this, from this Web3 angle? Because as I said, in my very first sentence, to the wider public, we are not always depicted in the most favorable light, right?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think to a degree, of course, it's biased because like the researchers that reach out, the researchers that are keen to explore collaboration are more open to experimentation. I think ultimately, at the end of the day, the researcher cares about having an impact, and like they need funding for that, and they realize, okay, there is a huge amount of funding now in crypto, and like a lot of crypto philanthropists that are actually funding science at a massive scale, like people like Vitalik and others. So I think they're more open than one would believe, and then especially, I think the historically also most well-known scientists right now are actually extremely good in the capital market. So for example is George Church from MIT. Like he probably co-created 200 companies, like some of them like in CRISPR space and other spaces. A lot of them already failed, but it's kind of like he's a machine at like having every of his students like turn as early as possible like their idea into a company, because then they just have much more access to capital. And I think a lot of researchers are seeing this model and seeing like struggling to get say $500,000, and like in this ecosystem there's like billions already flowing in like all of his research projects because they're as early as possible translated by a company. So I think researchers also coming to the fact that okay, like if they want to succeed, they need to understand the market, and ultimately I think it's in biomedical research the only way to get to humans is through clinical trials, which costs hundreds of millions. So of course it's different for basic science, but because we're focused on translational research, I think actually most researchers are happy about it, because of course also they realize like if they don't play with these incentives and are not open, for example, for biotech spin-off, then it's very likely that their research will only be a paper and like have no impact that is like measurable in the sense of like delivering a therapeutic to humans. So I think, yeah, like the researchers want to have the biggest impact, realize that they need like a biotech, for example, to commercialize their research.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Final question for now, promise. Why would you say you guys need to be organized as a Web3 organization, as a DAO? Could you not just be a Discord server with like a joint bank account or something?
Yeah, I think it's also a good question. I think the core, how I realize it, is that it's like Sam Altman made this point that it's like surprisingly easy to like buy doc NFTs or tokens, but hard to fund science or early stage startups, for example. And I think making it extremely easy to fund science is extremely high impact and useful. But I think to your point, I think the decentralization also happens, and it's just much more global in nature, in the sense that like we have people from Africa, from Singapore, from Germany, from like all over the world easily join it. I think it is very hard in the traditional Web2 world, but also like we don't want to be exposed to like a PayPal just saying like, oh, let's freeze this because like someone doesn't like it. Like in a sense, I think but then of course it's also the tokenization benefits that you can incentivize contributors and give them governance rights by, for example, someone who's writing an article for VitaDAO gets some tokens, someone who's referring a research project gets some tokens and some governance rights. And I think those things are extremely powerful, because then people feel also ownership over governing the research and getting involved, which I think, for example, foundation lacks. And it's to a degree, of course, just like it's way easier to join a DAO and a Discord than joining, for example, foundation.
Yeah, sure. That sounds about right. Kevin, you're also in the business of taking money and redistributing it, yeah, which is, broadly, along the same lines as Vincent, right?
Right.
How would you see the things that he says, as he said, in a different nuance, or do you think there's some of it that applies to you as well?
In terms of why a DAO versus a traditional?
Well, yeah, we can do that. We can do that first. That's great.
Okay, sure.
I have other questions, but let's do why a DAO first.
Well, I mean, I think the payment rails in Web3 just make that a lot easier, right? That you're facilitating peer-to-peer payments, and you're not ultimately becoming a payment provider yourself. I think that's a really strong reason to do it. But then also, I think coming back to the idea of it actually being, a community-governed project with governance token behind it, there's a lot of power in that, and it's, I think, benefiting the structure of the project.
Do you think people are inclined to give more if they feel they have at least a little say in?
I hope so. I mean, I think so, yes. I think a lot of people donate to projects on Gitcoin without necessarily being members of the DAO, though. So I think what we're seeing is a different kind of attraction of a different community that wants to like steer the future of it and help us decide like what the structure should be and how we should set things up.
That's super interesting. Can you give us a little bit of insight into the sociology of the Gitcoin DAO, a DAOist?
Yeah, I'm pretty new to it, so I'll be honest. I think I've been an observer for a long time and like an active participant for just a little while. I think what we're seeing is like it's a really interesting from like where talent finds its way in, right? So having come from more traditional background, there's much less of an like active outreach and much more sort of a passive. People sort of find their way to it. We're seeing this in a variety of projects where people just get interested. They start kind of participating, joining the Discord, and then they start showing some value and getting invited to more, and then become full-time contributors. So it's this really interesting kind of open door policy where people sort of find their way to us somehow, and get involved and start contributing at higher and higher levels.
Yeah, super interesting. Do they typically do that as a side job, or are they paid for this? Are they
I don't know, actually. That's a good question. I think it's a
Okay.
lot of people who are kind of in transition. They're kind of trying to decide, like, what do I want to do next? And as they do that, they're sort of exploring a variety of options. And they come in, they find a subgroup, something that they're interested in, start contributing their time, positive feedback loop, and then they get involved as contributors with like a full-time role.
Vincent
Yeah,
looks like
I just wanted to add, because I'm also like a Gitcoin contributor. Like on the very side, like for example, now we launched a science round with like I think $500,000 of matching funds, and like I've seen this, like we've also with VitaDAO launched a longevity Gitcoin round, and I think the powers really of Gitcoin is that it's just like intrinsically motivated people. Like I helped to start a longevity round not because I expected any rewards in return, but because I wanted to fund longevity research and exploring the mechanism of quadratic donations. I think the power is that it's like fairly easy to get involved. Like ultimately we like through a few messages with people from Gitcoin like got to this longevity Gitcoin round, and then helped basically to fundraise the matching fund and onboarded the projects. But then it happened. And basically, I think the power, what I always see like now also with the DeSci round on Gitcoin, is that it's just like the shelling point for people in the Ethereum ecosystem to do good. And like adding longevity or DeSci for me seemed logical to like make people aware that are already giving to like Ethereum public goods to also give to, for example, science public goods and add it to their basket. And I think that's like actually like I think a huge impact of Gitcoin. It's like has the strongest motivated community. Like since the DAO, there's like I haven't seen any DAO that has like as many intrinsically motivated people like coming together. Like in the DeSci for the round, like there were like 30 people in the ecosystem supporting, and like none of them getting any incentives or pay or anything, and they're like supporting like as much as they can to bring in donors to onboard people, but just because they care about the cause. I think that's really powerful about Gitcoin.
Thank you, Vincent. If you look at Gitcoin, obviously, kind of it functions in mostly in rounds. So basically, there's a matching pool, and basically the participation kind of is related to the size of the matching pool. So right. So basically, if you're going to donate to a project, basically the project is going to get some share of that. Your donation is being matched to a certain degree, and basically this is determined by by quadratic relation, right?
Right, exactly.
So how much do you think this stands and falls with the actual matching pool? So do you think people were to give if this would be taken away?
No, I don't think so at all, actually. I think that that's a strong motivator, right? I think I think that experience of, putting a couple DAI on a project and seeing that you've just brought 15 DAI to that project is this like really strong psychological motivator to get you over that free rider problem, right? Where it's very difficult to incentivize people to just donate anything altruistically unmatched, right, to projects. So I think that's been kind of the superpower is that quadratic funding.
But that also means you have to find the matching pool, right? You have to raise it from somewhere.
That's a lot of work, right? Yeah, that's the public goods funding work stream. There's a small team that's constantly raising funds, working with ecosystem partners to try to get folks like VitaDAO to support. So that's like what the DAO supports in itself is that fundraising mechanism and getting more and more communities involved.
Do you think if there were to be maybe an elected council, like not a DAO, that kind of determined where these funds were to go? I mean, you would kind of you would save a lot of overhead, right? So
maybe. I think what you'd give up in that, though, is the ability for this not to have this inner group deciding like what the best way to fund these projects is, but what we've opted for is this bottoms-up like wisdom of the crowd type approach, where any project arrives into the round with the same footing as any other project once it's passed a fraud screening, right, to make sure that it's a legitimate project. And once it's through there, it's really presented in the same sort of hierarchy as everything else, and it's really about the crowd showing up, donating to the projects they care most about. I think for us, what that shows, and I think in the restructuring of some of Gitcoin too, is if you look, we used to have one round, and now we have, it's in the teens now, how many side rounds run in parallel. So not just DeSci, but we have climate, we have DNI, we have a variety of things, crypto advocacy. Each of those rounds kind of has its own community and own goals, but the magic of all of these things running in parallel is the ability to steer from like the matching pool and some of these other things. Yeah.
So basically, maybe if I paraphrase this, the power comes from the stakeholdership of the individuals in the DAO.
Right. Is that true? I think to some degree, yes. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay. Ian, tell us about Token. So basically, Token is a trading venue for carbon credits, right? So for onboarding carbon credits into the Web3 ecosystem.
Yeah, you have it. So really our core functionality is how do we bring credits that already exist off-chain, where a lot of the value proposition of Toucan are some of the challenges we experience in the traditional market. So the traditional marketplaces are often the main value extractors are the brokers who end up kind of financing the projects instead of the product developers. You have, because it goes to the brokers, often there's no price discovery. There's often no instant liquidity as well. So if you have credits, you have to shop around to different brokers and try to find the highest price. And then there's been, in the past, a lot of issues around fraud behavior and double counting, which is just the idea of that a broker owns the credit and they sell the same credit to multiple people. And since all of that data is kind of in a closed database, you really aren't able to see any of that activity. So once you bring the carbon credits on-chain, you have a representation of the off-chain credit on-chain, you suddenly start fixing a lot of those problems about the opaque marketplace. You get instant price discovery with aspects of DeFi. And what this really opens the door to, which is really exciting, is because of the payment rails that were talked about earlier and these peer-to-peer networks, a lot of the people who are doing a lot of the carbon sequestration and a lot of the great groundwork are often small communities, indigenous peoples who have been traditionally marginalized by the financial system. And they're the people now, when they do develop projects, aren't extracting the value. As I said, it's mainly the brokers who are doing it. So one of the big exciting pieces of this is that because of blockchain and because these are now open sourced, you can see them on a permissionless blockchain, you can see the data trail of it, you understand how it's moving around. It's really easy to actually look at where the products are being financed and put money towards those projects. Within today's terms, those products are not considered as advantageous by the standards and the financiers because they aren't big enough to make it worth their while. And so Web3 has that range of investment opportunity and risk seeking where people are willing to put in $100 for a microloan for a project or tens of thousands for maybe 50, 60 hectares of land, which would be unheard of in the traditional world. So there's a lot of really exciting pieces that are moving along with Toucan, but our main focus now is really scaling up that carbon marketplace and really trying to get value back to the project developers and away from the brokers themselves.
Super interesting, and I mean, blockchain does enable that level of transparency and disintermediation, to use a buzzword. But don't you guys still have a huge problem, an Oracle problem, kind of onboarding these certificates onto the blockchain, in the first place? Because I think carbon offsetting or carbon credit trading has been hugely critiqued lately for greenwashing, basically kind of saying, look, this is a forest and it was there from Adam and Eve, and basically now we're kind of selling this as carbon credit on the blockchain. And I mean, you can make the entire on-chain process as transparent as you want. If you don't solve the Oracle problem, nothing is gained, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think a lot of the critiques that are about the carbon markets are pretty justified. I would say it's kind of just this idea that even it's kind of like what is the valuation we want to look at it from? Because if we just look at trees without the carbon credit aspect of it, there'll always be a power dynamic or some sort of political dynamic to want to convert those trees into commodities. And so what is the way that we can work together to make a valuation structure so a tree is worth standing up more than it is being cut down? And while it may not be as exciting for other people to want to tokenize nature and make biodiversity a very calculated economic element, we already kind of do that, but just in another direction. We do it in commodification of these assets as well. So I would say that's kind of the big takeaway I have with that is, we got to really choose what we want to do with this, and if we want to choose not to turn them into carbon credits or turn the biodiversity into natural capital assets, as they're kind of being called now, we kind of go in the other direction. And right now, we've been losing the climate crisis simply because we're not trying to do enough as quick as possible, and we're relying on the goodwill of people when we really need to make it about an incentive issue, because that's why we have the climate crisis in the first place. Is we have an incentive structure that encourages the extraction of these assets at a rate that doesn't really include the social benefits from them. So where do we find that kind of balancing act? And that's a really tricky question. A lot of people are trying to figure that one out, but it really is about making that biodiversity worth way more than it is being cut down. And as I just said, right now we've been relying on the goodness of others for conservation, and we're seeing that that's not a winning strategy.
Mm-hmm. Cool, thank you. That was a great answer. So I think we all understand what your projects are doing and kind of what how you are measuring your own impact, or how what you aspire to if you're not doing that yet, right? So. What do you think we as an ecosystem should optimize for humanity, right? So basically, if you ask yourself, why do I actually get up in the morning? Why do I do this? If you've been in crypto for long enough, probably not for the money. So it's, what metrics should we as a still fairly small ecosystem optimize for, to benefit humanity? I'll maybe start with Vincent, because I see you nodding.
Yeah, I think if one takes a step back, it's also a thing that got me excited. Early on was kind of how to have the biggest impact. And I think if one takes 2 steps back, it's I like kind of the impetus from the Gitcoin community of pluralism of different metrics and different values. And I think ultimately the world is optimizing GDP, and I think improving that metric and adding metrics to it is one of the highest impact ways. And I think historically, I think actually society, economic growth, if it would account for everything, would be the right metric. If one takes a step beyond our ecosystem, and I think actually blockchain is contributing to GDP and making the world more efficient. But I think. So basically, improving GDP, I think, is the one, and it's the whole kind of progress studies movement, how to make scientific and economical progress much quicker. And one way is to fund much more early stage research, and then it comes back to what we do. And I think another again metric for maximum impact, I think, is really coming from I think one of the most successful movements in history now is effective altruism with metrics QALYs, which is quality adjusted life years. And I think one is kind of to the degree we want to maximize human lives and happiness, and reducing suffering, reducing billions of people starving, but also animals and other things. So I think this is also one metric that we should look at, but it shouldn't be totalizing that we're just optimizing for GDP or just for QALYs. I think all of those, the world, I think, is making the mistake of totalizing GDP, and EA is making the mistake of totalizing QALYs and other things. I think to go back to the ecosystem one, I think to a degree, I think the ecosystem, like crypto, I think is, to be honest, extremely money driven, kind of in more GDP than effective altruism spectrum. But then I think a lot of the, for example, crypto billionaires, I think are very in the, for example, effective altruism camp. And I think actually someone like Vitalik is interesting because I think he's kind of not just purely funding effective altruism things, but also, for example, longevity research, which I think is one of the highest potential impacts because it adds a lot of quality life years for not that much money in a grand scheme, because you kind of create a benefit for every human. If you achieve, for example, even with the COVID pandemic, if you develop a vaccine, it brings value to everyone on Earth, and also to the next like millions of generations of humans. But I think it's a complex question. I think the cop-out answer is like ultimately we should improve GDP, and I think actually crypto can help in that and on, for example, the climate side to take in more of the external cost factors like climate destruction, so kind of like making GDP more sustainable. But I think for the ecosystem, it's like on GDP answer, like maximizing wealth and then doing the most good with it, like might be an answer that like a lot of people like Sam Bankman-Fried, for example, and others are chasing. That I think it's not the worst like way to add value. He's probably one of the most impactful people in crypto. So yeah, I don't have a great answer, but. Yeah.
Do you guys agree that maximizing GDP is what we should go for?
And improving GDP, importantly. Like, I think not in the current.
I'll agree with the improving the GDP metric more than just purely optimizing for it. As I come from the climate realm and focusing a lot on climate change, a lot of institutions like the White House, the UN, the Bank of England are all calling to add natural capital assets onto the balance sheet. And they make a great argument in their paper they present on linking environmental and economic statistics to decision making, which is just a fancy word for saying if there's a lake and the community relies on fish from that lake, how much value is the lake really producing, which is something that we don't really look at as much. We look at it from a value perspective of the land and then a value extraction from the livestock. But they give a great example that's saying, if you were to plant $40 million of urban forests in a city, and that reduced medical expenses, it's America as well, so by $60 million. From a net GDP perspective, you've actually lost $20 million instead of saving the communities and the public $20 million. You really just ruined $20 million from GDP. So I'll stand in the camp that if we work to improve it, there's definitely a lot of opportunity there, but in its current form, it's not quite optimized for positive externalities, social well-being, anything like that. But I agree with your ending there.
You looked unhappier.
Well, I think GDP is a tough one. I like what you're saying about improving the metric itself, right? And this classic problem of like you lose out on benefits because there's no economic activity from preventing spend in these public goods systems. So yeah, I'd say it's a pretty broken metric in itself, so I'd agree with that. But I would kind of go a level deeper, and I think you mentioned some interesting things about the sort of different kind of communities that can benefit from this work. What I would kind of steer towards more is identifying what those communities are and giving them the ability to solve their own problems, coordinate together, right? Because really what we're all talking about is like coordination failures, either at a global or a national or local level. And I think the real power of all of this technology is to improve on the coordination abilities of the humans involved, right? So giving them these tools, building these systems that allow them to collectively decide, what would be the best outcome for them. What is kind of missing in all of this, though, is sort of the feedback loop, right? So this is my self-critique of Gitcoin, right? We're really good at getting money out the door, but do we know if it's being spent effectively? Do we know if these projects are actually doing what they said they would do? There's sort of a sense that if a project isn't, that it wouldn't continue to receive funding, but we don't really have hard data on that, right? So that would be the thing to improve. And I love the proposals that we're seeing from folks like Protocol Labs around like impact certs or hyper certs and starting to create some kind of this is a kind of a marketification of this idea, but ultimately creating these feedback loops that allow people to be more informed, when they're deciding these things within their communities and making sure that they're arriving at optimal outcomes. So I'm in that pro sort of democracy camp. Like, let's let people decide at local and sort of the natural polity of those groups decide their own fates.
I'm very much with you in that I think I'm a moderator with an opinion, apparently. So I'm very much with you in that I think agency is something that lots of people lack, which leads them to not care. And I think kind of giving people back the idea that they can be their own, they run their own lives. And giving them back agency, I think this may be a large part of the solution, which I'm also totally pro-DAO. And I think this is an argument that is often neglected by the DAO people, because it's always kind of shared ownership and so on. But basically this idea that that even just being part of a community and feeling that you can change, even just your local world, this is something that has been lost over the last decades, right? So basically, maybe let's use the last 10 minutes to kind of talk about tooling that we could build to give people back agency and the control over their own lives in a way.
Yeah,
I don't mind going from the carbon perspective as well, which is where I'm sitting through. So the two big avenues that I see are, as I mentioned at the very beginning, most carbon projects and a lot of the land stewards of biodiversity today are indigenous peoples who have been marginalized by the economic system and by the global north for as long as we can remember and kind of record. So ways to really help this is, how do we design systems for them so that when we do they want to build carbon projects and they're carbon developers in the global south, how do we ensure and build the payment systems and the governance systems so that the actual indigenous communities that are building these actually get to extract the value from them? Currently, right now, that's not the case going on. So finding a way for them to extract the value, and it makes a lot of sense if you can just look at it from, well, what type of governance structures can we design in these smart contracts that when money is going to these places, and once we have the proper due diligence in places, this is kind of forward-looking, and there is technology that still needs to be kind of finalized in what they call the DMRV space, which is decentralized measurement, reporting, and verification, which is using satellite imagery or Internet of Things to kind of look at carbon sequestration potential of projects. Once kind of all those things are in place, how do we ensure that when the projects are getting financed, the money really is going to the indigenous peoples? And on top of that, how do we make sure that they, at the end of the day, can be the end value extractor? Right now, they don't usually get the money up front. That usually goes to the financier who's putting up the project. And then at the end of the day, when they sell it, it's all gone to the project financer. So what mechanisms can we design? And for me, those are things like proper microloans, proper ways of doing data analysis, and then proper governance smart contracts that can exist so we know that which community members are getting what and distributing this in equitable ways. And I liked what you were talking about earlier about the one thing that's really exciting about Web3 as well is we can almost build these economic structures in parallel of the real economic structure, the traditional one, and do a very fast test on them and run them through hyperspeed and see which ones win, and do it in a way where the traditional systems can opt in and co-opt those economic structures and governance structures instead of us trying to embed it in the current one, which has always tons of political feedback and challenges with it. So that's where I would say is the avenues to help.
Let me put you on the spot.
Sure.
I'll try not to be mean.
Okay. I'm ready.
I mean, we've heard this transparency and disintermediation pitch for the last 10 years, right? So what's the blocker? I mean, currently it's like a couple of million people using it. So how do we ship this to the normies?
How do we ship it to the normies? I think there's a couple levels to this. One is that the Web3 layer does need to get abstracted pretty far out of the picture. You have to be able to be using Web3 and the economic structures without kind of being hyper aware that you're using them and being savvy enough and tech savvy enough to interact with them. But I would say like this becomes a bigger question of just like the information and knowledge gap that you have between technically enabled areas and non-technically enabled areas where we think that technology is really accessible to everyone, but in reality, it really isn't accessible to as many people as they think it is. So I think that there's like some real core challenges in investing in infrastructure and getting the education there. But I would also even challenge myself in saying, do we believe that just because the way we organize our lives, we should have to put people into our economic system to make sure they have meaningful lives? I think that's a pretty challenging question at the end of the day. I think people live meaningful lives without technology, traditional ways, and those have tons of meaning. And so I see it being the complexity of the technology and then the access to it, and then I even think there it's not as clear cut of, this is the obvious route to take.
Yeah, so I think maybe I'm pushing you for a clear narrative, right? So basically, to me, obviously there are people who do not have smartphones, but say half of humanity has access to a smartphone. They could, in principle, participate. Say all of Berlin could, in principle, participate, and they're not. So what's the blocker? Clearly, maybe Vincent, you look like you have.
Yeah, I think actually, also going back to some of the work you with on Sorgos are doing, I think actually an answer could be onboarding humanity basically onto a UBI solution that could be blockchain enabled, in the sense, I think a lot of people, for example, the WorldCoin team has millions of people getting onboarded, mostly in the developing countries, because they get direct economic benefit from being onboarded.
But they're being onboarded. Lots of. So
Totally.
I don't want to kind of shit on the WorldCoin project, but I'll do. So so basically,
Totally.
Lots of people are being onboarded because there are incentives for the people onboarding them, and the people who are being onboarded, they often don't even know what this means. They just say, I'll give you $2, so I can scan your eyeball.
Yeah, 100%. I'm more talking about as an approach. I think global UBI could be an interesting way to onboard the world onto crypto, but to give them something, and it's a bit although again, I totally don't agree with their strategy, but I think it worked, is Facebook going to India and providing everyone in the country free Facebook access, free internet to use Facebook. And in a similar way, I think we just need to go broader. We need to just hand out $10 to every human in the world, and then and I think that could be easily incentivized. It could be vested tokens of a specific chain, and then a lot of people won't be able to onboard, but then they unlock it with activity or whatnot. But I think it just needs to go closer to their current lives. If it's an easy app that runs on every phone, if it's an easy credit card, and they just get and it's of course also just the growth hacks of Web 2, in the sense how did Airbnb or Uber scale to the world by giving $50 if you invite your friends, by creating incentives for onboarding people, and then of course adding a lot of value. Maybe you could use the first $10 to fund the climate research, or I think there's all kinds of ways to onboard people, but agree it's not easy and straightforward. I think we should learn from hyper growth in Web 2, from really good UX, and how to reach people across the world.
I love that, because we as Gnosis are already doing a lot of that. So you're kind of making my pitch here. I don't feel disadvantaged by the fact that I'm the moderator. So I'm taking mental notes here. So onboarding lots of people. What do you think, Kevin? Do you think this is kind of the stepping stone to success?
I think there's part of it. There's UX challenges, let's be clear. It's hard to use currently. It's easier now than it has been in the past, but it's still a lot of steps. And I think even pretty savvy people are turned off pretty quickly, right? So I think there's just an overall UX push, improving the wallet experience or better integrations to make sure that people, to your point, don't necessarily know they're interacting with it to interact with it. But I think the important part too is that we're kind of bringing these things into the real world, that there are real world use cases, that people are interacting with this stuff in a way which isn't, just as easy for them to say, oh, it's just a Ponzi, it's over here, it's just for these other people. There has to be real tangible real world benefit. And if that's something which is a local advocacy group that's been able to raise funds, steer those funds, and deploy them in their communities, I think those can have tangible real world impact that people can start seeing. So when you start creating those real-world feedback loops for people to see the benefits of this, and it doesn't feel extractive as it currently does.
Cool. Yeah, that would have been a super nice closing statement, but I have one more point I want to make. I have 1 minute 30 to make it. That being privacy. So so basically, you guys know we'll take a group picture later with Alex Partsev shirts because he's been. We don't know exactly what the charges are, because charges have not been brought, but basically it's implied that it's got something to do with his writing code for the Tornado project. What do you guys think? Can we use Web3 to give people back not just agency, but also, privacy? You're nodding, so I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I think it's right now, of course, it's not really good at enabling privacy, like Ethereum or blockchains in general. I think it's extremely important, of course, like mainly actually like the decentralization of like for example, like political actors in Ukraine to not be blocked by banks from Russia. I think it's very already obvious like how that is as important as privacy. But I think I agree. Like I'm excited by the privacy solutions out there, but I'm also worried that, like for example, an Aztec or someone is next if like hackers move there. But I think there's also technical I think solutions necessary to, for example, avoid the top 10 users of Tornado being all major hackers or like North Korea. Like that's also not
and Vitalik. So
yeah, totally. I'm like don't get me wrong. I actually donated to Tornado even without having used it like early on Gitcoin. But like for example, I didn't use it because I didn't want to put my money together with terrorists and. Like I think it's a reasonable worry. It's like in the sense that like it's the minority, for example, Tornado 0.1%, but like there could be ways to filter them out in a ZK or and I think that could be the future. It's like making it more regulatory compliant to be for the 99.9999% to be pro privacy.
I think there's an important story to tell around privacy that's been missing for a while, right? I think that still outside of the crypto ecosystem, people are kind of like willing to give up too much. And I think that would probably be an important part of normalizing crypto outside of it, but then making privacy seen as like a human right, that to not be observed and to not be have your data collected. Feels like something that there's been a sea change and there's a lot of education happening, and I'm seeing a lot more conversations outside of crypto around this. But I think that needs to be normalized as more of a core value outside of crypto, just to expect privacy and to seek systems that preserve it.
I'll let that stand as the closing word. Thank you guys for participating in this panel so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So let's get the t-shirts here. The Alex t-shirts. Are you guys the Alex? I can't see. I'm basically blinded. It's like, oh, you're here. Fantastic. Do you have a spare for me?
Yes.
Hello, everyone. For everyone that has a T-shirt, please come up to the stage. And for those that don't, there are still quite a few T-shirts right here on the stage for you. We're going to have a big group photo in support of Alex Bertiev. While everyone gets to the stage, I just would like to thank everyone for being here for this important demonstration of solidarity, not only for Alex Bertiev, but also for every developer here. As most of you know, the Dutch Financial Crimes Agency arrested Alex on the 10th of August. He suspected him of facilitating the money laundering through Tornado Cash. A demonstration was held on the 20th of August in Amsterdam, organized by the local blockchain community, which includes Crypto Canals and 1inch, attracting both the crypto as well as the national Dutch media. Their coverage raised some awareness about Alex's arrest. However, as of today, 34 days after his arrest, charges has still not been pressed. So we're waiting to see what happens there. So please join us on the stage, take pictures, share it on your socials so more people are made aware of this dangerous and outrageous precedent against privacy and open source. Please visit setalexfree.nl to sign the petition, join the official Telegram group for updates from the team that is supporting him back in Amsterdam. Lastly, a big thank you to Gnosis for supporting us with these t-shirts.